The city of Owerri was alive with music, laughter, and colors as people gathered for one of the biggest weddings of the year. Cars lined the streets, and guests stepped out in glittering gowns and sharp suits, each trying to outshine the other. Into this scene walked Amarachi, quietly holding her small clutch bag. She wore a plain gown she had stitched with her own hands, a soft fabric she could afford, cut simply but neatly. Compared to the women shimmering in imported lace and sequins, she looked modest, almost invisible. As she stepped into the hall, some heads turned briefly, then quickly looked away. To many, she was just another relative from the village. Nothing to admire, nothing to envy. Yet inside her heart beat fast. She had spent the night before carefully ironing her gown, pressing every seam, whispering to herself that confidence was her only jewel. But still, as she looked around at the glamorous crowd, a small ache grew in her chest. She smiled shyly at her cousin, the bride, glowing in a beautiful white gown. Amarachi knew that gown better than anyone. She had spent weeks sewing it, pouring love into every stitch. But no one knew it was her work. She had agreed to keep it quiet, happy enough to see her cousin shine. What she didn't know was that her quiet arrival in that simple dress would soon stir whispers, laughter, and eventually, a revelation that would change the story of the wedding forever. The music was still playing when Amarachi found a seat at the corner of the hall, hoping to blend in. She adjusted her gown, trying not to draw attention, but fate had other plans. From across the room came the voice she feared the most, her aunt, Auntie Ifeoma. Loud, confident, and always eager to embarrass someone, she walked straight towards Amarachi with a wide smile that quickly turned sharp. "Ah, look at you, Amarachi," she said loudly enough for half the table to hear. "Always looking so cheap. On a day like this, couldn't you at least borrow a decent dress? This is a wedding, not a village market." The words cut deep. Guests nearby chuckled, and some covered their mouths to hide their laughter. Auntie Ifeoma's voice carried further, and soon more people turned to look. Amarachi felt every pair of eyes on her, judging, measuring, mocking. She lowered her gaze, her fingers clutched tightly around her small clutch bag, but she said nothing. Inside, her heart burned. She wanted to shout back, to tell them that the bride's gown, the bridesmaids' dresses, even the little flower girls' outfits, all of them had been stitched by her hands. She wanted to remind her aunt that dignity was not measured in fabric price tags. But she swallowed her words, letting silence protect her pride. Some guests shook their heads, whispering to one another. They had seen Auntie Ifeoma humiliate Amarachi before, but today it felt sharper, almost cruel. Still, Amarachi sat quietly, her face calm, even though her chest tightened with hidden pain. She forced a small smile, refusing to let her tears fall in public. What nobody knew, not even her aunt, was that this same cheap girl was about to become the center of the entire wedding. And the voice that mocked her now would soon tremble with regret. Long before the wedding day, Amarachi spent her nights in a tiny workshop at the back of her mother's compound. It was a small wooden room with one sewing machine, a shaky table, and rolls of fabric stacked in the corner. While the world outside slept, she stayed up with a lamp glowing beside her, her fingers moving quickly and carefully. Stitch by stitch, she brought designs from her imagination to life. She had always loved fashion. As a little girl, she would cut old wrappers into tiny pieces, sewing dresses for her dolls. Growing up, while others laughed at her plain clothes, Amarachi was quietly learning the art of tailoring. She had no big shop, no loud advertisement, but those who trusted her work always came back. To her, sewing was not just a job, it was her way of creating beauty in a world that often tried to dim her light. When her cousin announced her wedding, Amarachi was the first to offer help. She worked for weeks, carefully drawing patterns, cutting fabrics, and stitching gowns that now glowed under the wedding lights. The bride's dress, admired by everyone for its perfect fit and delicate details, was Amarachi's masterpiece. The bridesmaids twirled gracefully in outfits she had designed, each one unique yet tied together in elegance. Guests whispered about the fine work, wondering which famous Lagos designer had created such beauty. But no one knew the truth. Amarachi had asked her cousin not to mention her name. She wanted her cousin to shine without any distractions. She was content to sit in the background, watching others smile in her creations. Now, as she sat in her simple handmade gown, mocked by her aunt, she carried the biggest secret of the night. The same girl being ridiculed as cheap was the very reason the wedding looked so glamorous. And while everyone laughed at her silence, Destiny was quietly preparing the moment when her hidden gift would no longer remain hidden. The laughter from Auntie Ifeoma's mockery still echoed in the hall, but not everyone was amused. As Amarachi sat quietly, staring down at her hands, a few sharp eyes in the crowd began to notice something others had missed. Her dress, though plain and without glitter, had a quiet charm to it. The cut was neat, the fit was perfect, and the stitching carried a touch of elegance that could not be bought in a boutique. Two women at a nearby table leaned closer, whispering, "That gown may look simple, but look at the finishing, it's not ordinary." Another nodded, adjusting her jewelry. "Exactly. The lines are too clean. Whoever made that dress has skill." Across the room, a man known in Owerri for importing fabrics tilted his head as he studied Amarachi. He muttered to his friend. "That girl's gown is hand-stitched. No factory work there. Someone with real talent touched that cloth." Even some of the younger guests, lovers of fashion and social media, began to notice. Phones secretly snapped pictures, not of the flashy imported lace, but of the quiet girl in the corner with a modest gown. They whispered among themselves, curious, debating whether her dress came from a hidden designer. Meanwhile, Auntie Ifeoma kept laughing loudly, repeating her insults, enjoying the attention. But now, some of the guests were no longer laughing with her. Instead, they glanced between her and Amarachi with faint disapproval. How strange, they thought, that someone would mock a girl who carried herself with such calmness and dignity. Amarachi, unaware of the quiet admiration spreading around her, kept her eyes down. She thought she was invisible, just a shadow in a hall full of stars. But the whispers had begun, and they carried a different story, that her gown, in its simplicity, was speaking louder than the sequins and glitter surrounding her. What started as laughter was slowly turning into curiosity. And curiosity, in a hall full of people, had the power to change everything. The reception was in full swing. Music filled the air, people danced, and laughter rolled across the decorated hall. The bride, glowing in her gown, sat beside her groom as the master of ceremony kept the crowd entertained. Then suddenly, his voice rose above the music, cheerful yet curious. "Ladies and gentlemen, please settle down. Our beautiful bride has a special request. She wants to thank the designer who made her gown. Can the designer of this masterpiece please stand up?" The hall fell silent, forks paused mid-air, glasses stopped halfway to lips, and heads turned in every direction. Everyone waited for a tall, stylish Lagos designer to make a grand entrance. Some even imagined a celebrity fashion icon walking in, ready to soak in the applause. Auntie Ifeoma smirked widely, fanning herself with pride. She whispered loudly, "Just watch, Amarachi. This is what real designers look like. You'll see the kind of people who create such beauty." She glanced at her niece with mocking eyes, certain that the moment would prove her point. But no one stood up. The silence stretched on. The MC repeated the call, this time with more drama. "Please, the bride insists, we must honor the genius behind this gown. Who is the artist that made our bride shine like a queen today?" Guests exchanged confused glances. Some craned their necks toward the door, expecting someone to step in. Others whispered names of famous designers. A few looked at the bride curiously, waiting for her to reveal the secret. The bride smiled softly, her eyes searching the crowd. She knew exactly where the real designer sat, in the corner, wearing a modest handmade gown, looking almost invisible. Amarachi lowered her head, her heart pounding. She never expected her cousin to call her out in front of everyone. She had chosen to stay in the background, but destiny was dragging her forward. And so, as the silence deepened, all eyes unknowingly began to drift toward Amarachi. She still sat frozen, unsure whether to rise or remain hidden. The storm her aunt had started with her mockery was about to break wide open, in the most unexpected way. The hall was silent, every guest waiting for a famous designer to stand. Amarachi sat frozen, her heart thumping so loudly she thought people around her could hear it. Her cousin, the bride, kept her eyes on her, nodding gently as if to say, "It's your moment. Don't hide." With trembling hands, Amarachi pushed back her chair and rose slowly to her feet. The sound of the chair scraping the floor was enough to draw every pair of eyes toward her. First, people looked confused. Then, as the truth sank in, a wave of gasps filled the air. "That girl," someone whispered in shock. "The one in the plain dress?" another asked. Mouths fell open, fans froze mid-air, and conversations stopped. The same young woman who had been mocked as cheap was now revealed as the genius behind the dazzling gowns that had captured everyone's admiration. The bride, overcome with emotion, stood up and rushed across the hall. She wrapped Amarachi in a tight hug, tears streaming down her face. Her voice shook as she said, loud enough for the guests to hear, "You made me shine today, sister. Every stitch, every detail, it was your hands. I am proud of you." The hall erupted, not with laughter this time, but with applause. Some guests stood, clapping with genuine admiration. Others whispered in embarrassment, recalling how they had laughed at her only moments ago. A few women looked down, ashamed that they had joined Auntie Ifeoma's mocking. Amarachi felt her throat tighten, her eyes wet, but she managed to smile. She had not needed jewels or sequins to prove her worth. Her work spoke louder than anything she could wear. In that moment, the village-looking girl was no longer invisible. She was the star of the wedding, shining brighter than the chandeliers above. And somewhere in the crowd, Auntie Ifeoma's smile had disappeared, replaced with a stiff, uneasy silence. The laughter she had started had now turned into the applause that crowned Amarachi with honor. Auntie Ifeoma's smile froze as Amarachi stood proudly beside the bride. For a moment, she looked as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She tried to clap along with the guests, but her palms met weakly, her face stiff. Everyone had seen how loudly she mocked Amarachi earlier, and now the truth was burning her like fire. She leaned toward the women at her table, forcing a laugh. "Ah, you know I was only joking with her. That's how I play with my niece." But her voice trembled, and no one believed her. Instead, the women exchanged looks and shook their heads. Whispers spread quickly through the hall like wildfire. "So it's her. The same girl Auntie Ifeoma called cheap," one woman murmured. Another replied, "Yes, oh. Imagine mocking your own blood while she was the one who made everyone shine." Some women clicked their tongues in disapproval. "Envy within families is the worst kind," an older guest said quietly, her eyes fixed on Auntie Ifeoma. Around the tables, more heads nodded. The same people who laughed with her earlier now kept their distance, as if ashamed to have joined her mockery. Auntie Ifeoma shifted uncomfortably in her chair, fanning herself harder than before. Her once loud voice was gone, replaced with silence. She avoided eye contact, pretending to be busy with her drink, but she could feel the weight of the stares. Every laugh she had thrown at Amarachi was now echoing back at her, turning into whispers of her own disgrace. Meanwhile, Amarachi stood with quiet dignity, receiving hugs, handshakes, and compliments. Guests praised her talent openly. "Your hands are blessed. You are going places, my dear." Each word only deepened her aunt's humiliation. For the first time that day, Auntie Ifeoma had nothing to say. The woman who had always spoken the loudest in every gathering now sat in silence, her pride bruised, her reputation slipping through her fingers. She had wanted Amarachi to look small, but instead she had made her shine brighter than anyone in the room. And as the applause carried on, one truth became clear to everyone: sometimes the mocker ends up being the one most mocked. The hall was still buzzing from the shocking revelation when a man with a camera slung around his neck rushed toward Amarachi. He was a journalist covering the wedding for a local lifestyle magazine. His eyes shone with excitement as he spoke quickly, almost out of breath. "Madam, your work is breathtaking," he said, pointing at the bride's gown and the bridesmaids. "Please, can we feature you in our fashion magazine? People must know the genius behind these designs." Before Amarachi could even reply, the first camera flash went off, then another. Guests pulled out their phones, snapping pictures and recording videos. For years she had worked quietly in her tiny workshop, hidden from the spotlight, and now she was standing in the middle of a glittering hall with everyone's attention on her. Some guests, eager to get close, started asking her questions. "Do you take orders? Where is your shop? Can you design for my daughter's wedding?" Amarachi smiled shyly, her voice soft but steady as she answered. She could hardly believe this was happening. The same hall where she had been laughed at an hour ago was now filled with applause and admiration for her. The bride held Amarachi's hand proudly, lifting it up as though presenting her to the world. "This is my sister," she said, her voice full of joy. "She is the one who made me shine today. Without her, this wedding would not look this beautiful." The hall clapped again, and the cameras clicked even faster. Even those who had ignored Amarachi earlier now pushed forward, eager to be photographed beside her. Some guests whispered among themselves, saying, "She's the real star of the night, not even the bride." Amarachi's heart swelled. She had not planned any of this, yet here she was, standing under bright lights, her name about to appear in a magazine. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. And somewhere in the corner, Auntie Ifioma sat quietly, watching the niece she once mocked become the center of admiration. The same cheap girl she had ridiculed was now shining so brightly that no one else in the hall could outshine her. Amarachi had become the star of the night. As the evening slowed down and guests began to leave, Amarachi stood near the corner of the hall, still surrounded by people congratulating her. The applause had died down, but the respect in the eyes of the guests remained. For the first time, she felt no need to hide in the shadows. She had been seen, truly seen. It was then that Auntie Ifioma slowly walked toward her. Her steps were softer than usual, her voice no longer loud and commanding. She forced a smile, trying to sound warm. "My dear," she began gently, "you should have told us you had such talent. We would have supported you. You know we are family." But the words sounded empty. Everyone remembered how she had mocked Amarachi only hours before. Guests nearby watched the scene with curiosity, whispering to each other. Some shook their heads, smiling knowingly. "See how tables turn," one woman muttered. "The same aunt who mocked her is now begging to stand close." Amarachi looked at her aunt, her face calm, her smile polite. She did not argue, she did not remind her of the insults. Instead, she simply nodded and said softly, "Thank you, Auntie." Her tone carried no bitterness, but her silence spoke louder than any words could. For the first time, Auntie Ifioma seemed small. The woman who always dominated conversations, who always held the loudest laugh in the room, now stood awkwardly, desperate to win back some respect. She tried to touch Amarachi's hand, but the younger woman gently shifted, busy with other well-wishers. Guests noticed. The power had shifted completely. The aunt who once mocked to feel superior was now the one seeking favor. Some people even smiled as they watched, whispering, "God has lifted her right before their eyes." Amarachi did not boast, nor did she throw her success in her aunt's face. She simply carried herself with grace, knowing her dignity was restored. She no longer needed to defend herself, the truth had already done that. And as she turned back to greet another guest, Auntie Ifioma quietly stepped aside, her face pale with regret. That night, everyone saw clearly who the true queen of the family was. By the end of the night, Amarachi was no longer just a quiet girl in the corner. Her name had traveled around the hall like fire. Guests who once ignored her now lined up to ask for her number. "Please, can you design for my daughter's wedding?" one woman begged. Another man said proudly, "You don't belong in a small workshop anymore. Fashion houses in Lagos will fight to have you." Business cards slipped into her hands. Promises of opportunities filled her ears. Amarachi stood there in the same simple handmade gown that had been mocked hours earlier, but now that very gown looked like royalty. The stitching, the fit, the grace it carried, all of it had become her crown. She smiled to herself as she whispered under her breath, "Sometimes simplicity is the loudest crown." The same hall where laughter once stung her now echoed with admiration. The same relatives who once looked down on her now looked up to her with respect. Even the bride, glowing with pride, kept holding her hand as if to say, "You deserve this moment more than anyone." When Amarachi finally walked out of the wedding hall, She was not the mocked niece anymore. She was Amarachi, the celebrated designer, the young woman whose hidden talent had turned into her glory. And as the cool night air touched her face, she lifted her chin, knowing this was only the beginning of a new chapter, the rise of a queen in her own right.